"The rightful heir has arrived," my daughter-in-law said softly, as she placed the envelope into my hands. "So it's time for you to make space." I was still holding my grandson when she said it, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, his breath warm against my wrist, the room filled with that quiet, sacred joy that only comes when new life enters the world. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, because nothing about that sentence belonged in that moment. Not in a hospital room bathed in pale morning light. Not with my son standing just a few feet away, watching us. Not when I had waited 9 long months to hold this child, to feel like I still had a place in this family I had built with my own hands. I looked down at the envelope, my name written neatly across the front in Olivia's careful handwriting. And I remember thinking how strange it was that she had prepared something formal for a day like this, something deliberate, something that required planning, while I had come with nothing but a small knitted blanket and a heart full of love. I opened it slowly, carefully, because my hands did not tremble. They never had, not even when my husband passed 5 years ago, not even when I signed the last of the mortgage papers on the house we had lived in for over 3 decades, and inside was a single sheet of paper, clean, official, unmistakable, an eviction notice addressed to me, Margaret Collins, instructing me to vacate the property within 30 days. I read it once, then again, each word settling into place with a kind of quiet finality. And when I looked up, Olivia was watching me with that same composed expression she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes, while Daniel stood beside her, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as if he had already decided not to be part of this moment. "It's just practical," she added, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if she were explaining something obvious, something reasonable. "The house needs to be for our son now, for his future, and things need to be clear." And I noticed the way she said our son, not your grandson, not your family, but something smaller, tighter, something that didn't include me. I folded the paper neatly along its crease, slid it back into the envelope, and rested it on the chair beside me. Then I adjusted the blanket around the baby, smoothing it with slow, deliberate movements, the way I used to when Daniel was this small, when everything felt certain, when love wasn't something you had to question or measure or defend. No one spoke after that, not for a while. The silence stretching across the room like something fragile that might break if touched, and I realized then that this hadn't started today, not really. This moment had been building for months, maybe longer, in the quiet spaces between conversations, in the way decisions were made without me, in the way my name stopped appearing on documents I used to sign without thinking. And as I handed my grandson back to Olivia, I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that didn't ask for anything, didn't reveal anything. Because if there was one thing I had learned after 68 years, it was this: when people believe they've already taken everything from you, that's when they stop paying attention to what you still have left. I did not go back to the house that day, not right away, even though it was only a 20-minute drive from the hospital, and I knew exactly what waited for me there. The same quiet living room, the same polished wood floors, the same photographs lined across the mantel, each one a reminder of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Instead, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot with the engine off, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, untouched since I had folded it closed, and I watched as families came and went through the sliding glass doors. Young couples carrying newborns wrapped in pastel blankets, grandparents smiling, holding balloons, taking pictures, celebrating something that was supposed to be simple and joyful. And I realized how easily that picture could be rewritten, how quickly a role could be reassigned without warning. Daniel had always loved that house. Even as a boy, he would run through the halls with bare feet, laughing, his voice echoing off the walls. And I used to tell him that one day it would all be his, not because I was giving it away, but because it was something we shared, something built together, brick by brick, payment by payment, year after year. And when his father passed, I thought that promise still held, that what we had built as a family could not be undone by time or by loss. But somewhere along the way, that understanding had shifted into something quieter, something I did not fully see until it was already too late. It started small, the way most things do, with little decisions made without me. Conversations that happened in the kitchen after I had gone upstairs, paperwork that Daniel said he would handle so I would not have to worry, and I believed him because he was my son. because I had raised him to be honest, to be kind, to protect the people who loved him, and for a long time, I convinced myself that Olivia was simply different, not unkind, just practical, focused, someone who saw the world in terms of efficiency and future planning, words she used often, especially when she talked about finances, about investments, about making sure everything was secure for what she would call the next generation. I remember the first time she suggested changing the title on the house. It was presented as a formality, a way to simplify things, to make sure that if anything ever happened to me, Daniel would not have to deal with complicated legal processes, and I agreed because it sounded reasonable, because I trusted them, because I did not see the difference between having my name first on the document or second, or even not at all, not. When I still lived there, still paid the property taxes, still maintained every inch of that home with the same care I always had. But trust, I have learned, does not disappear all at once. It fades in pieces, quietly, in the background, until one day you look up and realize it is no longer there. The phone rang just as I was about to start the engine, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in me shifted, something small but steady, and I reached for it. The screen lighting up with a name I had not seen in months, Harold Bennett, my late husband's attorney, a man who had handled every document, every signature, every detail of our lives when things were still clear and balanced, and I answered, not because I expected anything to change, but because I suddenly understood that not everything had been taken from me, not yet, and when he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate, the first thing he said was not a greeting, not a question, but a statement that settled into the silence like something solid, something real. Margaret, there is something in your husband's will that you need to see, something they may have overlooked. Harold asked if I could meet him that afternoon, and I told him yes without needing to think about it, because something in his tone carried a weight I recognized, the kind that does not come from routine matters or casual updates. And as I started the car, I noticed how steady my hands felt on the steering wheel, how clear everything suddenly seemed, not easier, not lighter, but sharper, as if a layer of uncertainty had been quietly removed and replaced with something more defined. His office was just under 10 miles away, a familiar brick building on the corner of Maple and 3rd, the same place my husband and I had walked into years ago to sign documents that marked the milestones of our lives. And when I stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and old paper greeted me like an echo from another time, one where decisions were made together, where nothing important happened without both of us at the table. Harold stood when he saw me, his expression kind but measured, and after a brief greeting, he gestured for me to sit, placing a folder in front of me that looked thicker than anything I remembered from before, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence filled with the quiet understanding that whatever was inside that folder mattered more than anything that had happened earlier that day. He opened it carefully, turning a few pages before sliding one toward me, and I recognized my husband's signature immediately, the firm, deliberate strokes that had always reflected his way of doing things, precise, thoughtful, never rushed, and as my eyes moved across the page, I felt something shift again, not in shock this time, but in recognition, as if I were rediscovering something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. It was a clause, clearly written, added in the final months before his passing, stating that the property, the house we had shared for 32 years, could not be sold, transferred, or reassigned without my explicit and ongoing consent, and more than that, it specified that I retained full residency rights for the duration of my life, regardless of any future changes in ownership or title, and I read it twice, then a third time, each word settling into place with quiet certainty. Harold watched me as I read, then leaned back slightly, folding his hands, and explained that the clause had been added as a safeguard, something my husband had insisted on after noticing what he described as a growing influence from outside voices, though at the time, I had not understood what he meant, or perhaps I had chosen not to look too closely, trusting that everything would remain as it had always been, stable, secure, unchanged. They may have assumed the title transfer was enough, Harold said, his voice calm, almost gentle. But this clause overrides that assumption. It is very clear. Margaret, no one can remove you from that house without your agreement. And I let those words settle, not as a victory, not as relief, but as clarity, the kind that does not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. I closed the folder slowly, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, and in that stillness, I thought about Daniel, about the boy who used to run through those halls, about the man who had stood in that hospital room and chosen silence, and I realized that whatever came next would not be about anger or confrontation. It would be about something far simpler, something far quieter, and far more permanent. And when I finally looked up at Harold, I did not ask what I should do, because for the first time since that envelope had been placed in my hands, I already knew. When I stepped back into the house that evening, nothing looked different, and that was the first thing that told me everything had changed. The same soft lights spilling across the hardwood floors, the same clock ticking steadily in the hallway, the same faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air, but there was something else now, something quieter, something that did not belong to me anymore in the way it once had. And I set my purse down on the entry table with the same care I always had, my fingers brushing the edge of the wood where Daniel had once carved his initials as a boy, a small imperfection I had never sanded away because it reminded me that this house had been lived in, loved, shaped by time and family, not just owned. I walked into the kitchen and stood for a moment, taking in the details I knew by heart, the placement of every cabinet, the slight creak in the third floorboard near the sink, the window that caught the morning sun just right. And I realized how easily all of this could have been taken from me if I had not answered that phone call, if I had not chosen to listen, and I poured myself a glass of water, not because I was thirsty, but because the act itself grounded me, something simple, something steady, something that still belonged entirely to me. I did not call Daniel that night, and he did not call me, and that silence spoke more clearly than any words could have. It told me that whatever decision had been made, it had been made together, without hesitation, without doubt, and more importantly, without me. And I sat at the dining table where I had served countless meals over the years, running my hand along its surface, remembering birthdays, holidays, quiet Sunday mornings when everything felt whole, and I let those memories settle, not as something to hold on to, but as something to understand, because looking back, the signs had always been there. I had simply chosen to interpret them differently. Olivia had never raised her voice, never openly disrespected me, and that was what made it so easy to overlook the changes she introduced, the way she reorganized the kitchen without asking, the way she spoke about the house as if it were already theirs, the way she gently corrected Daniel when he referred to it as my home, replacing the word with ours. And I remember the first time she used that word, how small it seemed, how insignificant, just a shift in language, but now I understood that it had never been small. It had been a beginning. I finished my water and set the glass down carefully. Then I walked to the study, the one room I had kept almost exactly as my husband left it, his books still arranged in the same order, his chair still angled toward the window, and I sat down, pulling open the drawer where I kept old documents, letters, things that mattered once and still held meaning even when they were no longer needed. And I added the folder Harold had given me to that space, not hiding it, not protecting it, simply placing it where it belonged, among the pieces of a life that had been built with intention. I did not feel anger, not the kind that burns or demands to be expressed. What I felt instead was something steadier, something clearer, a quiet understanding that what had happened was not a single moment, not just an envelope in a hospital room, but the result of choices made over time, choices I had trusted, choices I had allowed, and now, for the first time, I saw them for what they were. I turned off the light and left the study, pausing briefly in the hallway as the house settled into its usual evening quiet, and I knew then that nothing needed to be rushed, nothing needed to be forced, because the truth had already been written, long before today, long before Olivia handed me that envelope. And as I made my way upstairs, I allowed myself one final thought, simple and certain. They believed they had secured the future, but they had misunderstood the past. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm that does not ask permission before settling into a space, and I moved through the house the way I always had, not as someone preparing to leave, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood. I made coffee, measured out 2 scoops the way my husband used to prefer, even though I now drank it alone, and I stood by the kitchen window watching the early light stretch across the backyard, the fence Daniel had painted one summer when he was Barely 16, the oak tree that had grown taller than the roofline over the years. All of it still there, unchanged, untouched, and yet carrying a different weight now that I could see the full shape of what had been set in motion. I did not rush. I did not gather boxes or sort through drawers the way someone might when given 30 days to leave. Instead, I cleaned. I wiped down the counters, straightened the chairs, watered the plants in the living room. Small acts that anchored me in the present, actions that belonged to someone who was not being removed, but who was choosing how to remain. Around mid-morning, I heard the front door open, the familiar sound of keys turning, followed by footsteps that paused just inside, as if whoever had entered was unsure of what they might find. And when I walked into the hallway, Daniel was standing there, his posture stiff, his expression caught somewhere between expectation and hesitation, while Olivia stood just behind him, her eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on me. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, the silence carrying more meaning than any greeting could have. "We thought you might be packing," Daniel said finally, his voice careful, measured, as if he had rehearsed the line on the drive over. And I noticed the way he avoided looking directly at me, choosing instead to focus on a spot just to my left. And I let the words sit between us for a second before answering. Not quickly, not defensively, just evenly. "I am not going anywhere today." And something shifted then, subtle but immediate, Olivia's expression tightening just enough to reveal that this was not the response she had expected, not the quiet compliance, not the silent retreat they had likely prepared themselves to witness. "Margaret," she began, her tone still controlled but carrying a faint edge now. "We gave you the notice. We agreed that it would be best to move forward without complications." And I nodded slightly, acknowledging the sentence without accepting its meaning, because I understood now that what they called agreement had never included me in the first place. It had only ever been a decision made in my absence, and I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room, inviting them in the same way I always had, because this was still my home, not in a way that needed to be argued or proven in that moment, but in a way that simply existed, quietly, undeniably. We sat down, the three of us arranged in a space that had once been easy, once filled with ordinary conversations about work, about dinner, about plans for the weekend, and now held something else entirely, something more deliberate, more calculated, and I folded my hands in my lap, not to steady myself, but because there was no need for movement, no need for urgency. And when I finally spoke, I did not raise my voice or accuse or question. I simply said, "I spoke with Harold Bennett yesterday." And this time, Daniel looked at me, really looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand where this was going. While Olivia remained still, her attention sharpened, her silence more telling than any interruption could have been, and I watched them both carefully, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity, because in that moment, I was no longer trying to hold on to what I thought we were. I was simply seeing what we had become, and that made all the difference. Olivia was the first to react, though she did it quietly, the way she always handled things when she felt control beginning to slip, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her handbag, her posture straightening as if she were preparing to correct a misunderstanding. "Harold Bennett?" she repeated, her tone measured, but there was a pause before his name, just long enough to reveal that she recognized it. And that recognition mattered more than anything she could have said. While Daniel shifted beside her, his shoulders tensing, his attention now fully on me in a way it had not been before, as if the conversation had finally moved into territory he could not ignore. I nodded once, not elaborating, not rushing to fill the silence that followed, because I had learned that people often reveal more when they are left alone with their own thoughts. And I could see it happening now. The calculations behind Olivia's eyes, the quiet unease beginning to surface in Daniel's expression, the realization that something they had assumed was settled might not be as final as they believed. He reviewed the will. I continued, my voice even, steady, carrying no accusation, no emotion beyond simple clarity. "And there is a clause that neither of you mentioned." And I let that sentence rest between us, not as a challenge, but as a fact, something that did not need to be defended because it already existed. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands coming together as if he were about to speak, then hesitating, and I watched that hesitation carefully, because it told me more than words could. It told me that he did not know, not fully, not in the way Olivia did. And that difference mattered. It created a space, a small but important gap between them, one built on information, on understanding, on intention. What clause? He asked finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and I turned my gaze toward him, meeting his eyes without pressure, without expectation, simply allowing him to see me as I was, not as someone being removed, not as someone stepping aside, but as someone who had not yet finished her part in this story. The house cannot be transferred in a way that removes my right to live here, I said, choosing each word carefully, not to emphasize, not to persuade, but to state. Your father made that clear before he passed, and I saw it then, the moment when the understanding reached him, not all at once, but in pieces, the way truths often arrive, slowly, settling into place until they can no longer be ignored. Olivia exhaled softly, a controlled release of breath that might have gone unnoticed in another moment. But here, now, it carried weight, and she stepped forward slightly, her voice regaining its composure, though something beneath it had shifted, something less certain. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, and I almost smiled, not because the words were surprising, but because they were expected, the first response when a carefully constructed plan meets something it did not account for. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the drawer of the side table beside me and took out the folder, placing it gently on the coffee table between us, turning it so they could see, not pushing it toward them, not forcing the moment, just allowing it to exist where it belonged, in the open, where it could no longer be avoided. Daniel's eyes moved to the document, then back to me, then again to the paper, and I could see the shift happening, not just in what he understood, but in what he was beginning to question, and that, more than anything, was the beginning of something new, not a confrontation, not an argument, but a quiet unraveling of what had been assumed, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to push. The truth had already done what it needed to do, and for the first time since that envelope had been placed in my hands, I could see that they had not been preparing me to leave. They had simply underestimated the foundation they were standing on. Daniel reached for the folder before Olivia could stop him, his movements slower than usual, as if he already suspected what he would find inside, and I watched him carefully, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with the same quiet attention I had given him when he was a child trying to understand something beyond his years, because in many ways, that was exactly what this moment was, a realization forming in real time, piece by piece, line by line. He opened the document and began to read, his eyes scanning the page once, then again, more slowly the second time, and I saw the shift happen not in his posture, but in his expression, the tightening around his eyes, the slight parting of his lips, the kind of reaction that comes when something does not align with what you were told to believe. And when he finally looked up, it was not at Olivia, not immediately, but at me, as if searching for confirmation that what he had just read was real, that it was not something misinterpreted or exaggerated. This says, he started, then stopped, glancing back down at the page, his voice trailing off as he tried to reconcile the words with the plan that had already been set in motion. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. It told me that he had not been part of every conversation, that there were details he had trusted someone else to manage, and that trust had been placed without question. Olivia stepped forward then, her composure returning in careful layers, each movement controlled, each breath measured, and she reached out, placing her hand lightly on the edge of the folder, not taking it, not pulling it away, just anchoring herself to it, as if proximity alone could restore order. Daniel, it is more complicated than that, she said, her voice steady but firm, and I noticed how she positioned herself slightly between him and me, not physically blocking, but creating a subtle division, a line that had been there for a long time, only now becoming visible. Daniel looked at her, then back at the paper, and for the first time since they had walked through the door, he did not immediately accept her explanation. He paused, and that pause was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight, it created space, and in that space, something began to shift. I did not speak, I did not interrupt, because there was nothing I needed to add. The document had already done what it was meant to do. It had introduced doubt where there had once been certainty. And doubt, I have learned, does not need to be forced. It grows on its own once it has been planted. Why was this not mentioned before? Daniel asked quietly, his voice no longer rehearsed, no longer controlled in the same way it had been when he first arrived, and Olivia's response came quickly, almost too quickly, a smooth explanation about legal language, about how clauses can be interpreted differently, about how they had believed everything had been handled correctly, and I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the rhythm of them, the way they flowed without pause, without hesitation, as if they had been prepared. Long before this moment, and I understood then that this was not the first time she had shaped a narrative, only the first time it had been questioned. Daniel did not respond right away, and that silence, once again, spoke more clearly than anything he could have said. It stretched between them, not hostile, not confrontational, but uncertain, and uncertainty has a way of revealing what certainty hides. It exposes the edges, the places where things do not quite fit, and I saw it in the way he held the paper now, not loosely, not casually, but with a kind of careful attention, as if he were holding something fragile, something that could change depending on how closely he examined it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not about winning, not about proving a point. It was about letting the truth settle where it needed to settle, and as I watched them, I realized that the balance had already shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but in a quieter, more lasting way, the kind that does not reverse itself easily. And for the first time since they had stepped into this house expecting to finalize something, I could see that they were no longer certain of how this would end. The silence that followed did not break. It settled, stretching across the room in a way that felt deliberate, as if the house itself had decided to hold its breath and wait. And I remained exactly where I was, my hands still folded, my posture unchanged, because there was no need to shift, no need to react. Everything that needed to move was already moving, just not in a way that could be seen at first glance. Daniel closed the folder slowly, not with the certainty he had opened it with, but with care, as though the pages inside carried more weight than paper should, and he set it down on the table between us, not pushing it away, not pulling it closer, simply placing it where it could not be ignored. And when he looked at Olivia this time, there was something different in his expression, not anger, not accusation, but something quieter, something more unsettling, a question that had not yet been asked out loud. "You told me everything was clear," he said, and his voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The steadiness of it carried more meaning than any confrontation could have, and Olivia did not answer right away, which in itself was an answer, a small one, but enough. She shifted slightly, adjusting her stance, her eyes moving briefly toward me before returning to Daniel, and I recognized that movement, the instinct to assess, to recalibrate, to find a new angle when the previous one no longer holds. And when she spoke again, her tone had softened, not in warmth, but in strategy. "It is clear, Daniel, this does not change what we discussed." And there it was, the word "we," placed carefully, deliberately, an attempt to draw him back into alignment, to remind him of where he was supposed to stand. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that hesitation grew, expanding into something more solid, something that could no longer be smoothed over with a simple explanation. And I could see it in the way he leaned back slightly, creating space between himself and the conversation, between himself and her. And that space mattered. It was the first real distance I had seen between them since they arrived. I reached forward then, not to reclaim the folder, but to straighten it, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table. A small gesture, almost insignificant, but it grounded the moment, gave it shape, and I spoke only once more, my voice calm, even, without emphasis. "No one needs to leave today." And I let that statement settle, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as a simple fact, one that did not require agreement to be true. Olivia's eyes flickered, just for a second, and I saw it then. The realization, not complete, not fully formed, but present, that this situation was no longer unfolding according to her expectations. That control had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could be seized back quickly, but in a slower, more permanent way, the kind that changes outcomes before anyone realizes it has happened. Daniel stood up first, his movements measured, thoughtful, and he looked around the room, not in the way someone evaluates a space, but in the way someone recognizes it, perhaps for the first time in a long while. And when his gaze returned to me, there was something there that had not been present earlier, something quieter, more complicated, and he nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried acknowledgement, if not understanding. Olivia followed, her posture still composed, but there was a tension now, a subtle shift in the way she held herself, as if recalculating, adjusting to a new set of conditions she had not anticipated, and as they moved toward the door, I did not follow, I did not see them out. I remained where I was, because this was still my place, not in a way that needed to be defended, but in a way that had already been defined long before today. The door closed behind them with a soft, familiar sound, and the house returned to its quiet, steady rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but no longer uncertain beneath it. And I sat there for a moment longer, allowing the silence to settle back into its natural shape, knowing that what had just happened was not an ending, not even a confrontation, but the beginning of something far more precise, far more deliberate, and far more difficult to undo. The house felt quieter that night, not empty, not abandoned, but settled in a way I had not noticed before, as if something unresolved had finally found its place. And I moved through each room without turning on unnecessary lights, letting the soft glow from the hallway guide me, because I did not need brightness to see what was already clear. I paused in the living room, my eyes drifting to the photographs on the mantel, Daniel as a child with grass stains on his jeans, my husband standing beside him with that steady smile he carried through every stage of our lives, and I reached out, not to adjust them, not to straighten anything, just to acknowledge that those moments had been real, that they still mattered, even if the present had shifted into something different. The days that followed did not bring dramatic changes, no raised voices, no sudden confrontations. Instead, there was a quiet distance, a series of small, careful interactions that replaced what had once been effortless. Daniel called once, his voice more subdued than I remembered, asking if we could talk. Not about the house, not directly, but about everything around it, the kind of conversation that circles the truth before it finds the courage to face it. And I listened, not interrupting, not guiding him, allowing him to speak in his own time, because some realizations cannot be given, they have to be reached. Olivia did not call, but her absence spoke just as clearly. It told me that she was waiting, recalculating, deciding how to move forward in a situation that no longer followed the path she had set. And I understood that silence too, not as avoidance, but as strategy. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to anticipate it, to prepare for it, because whatever came next would no longer be decided without me. One afternoon, I returned to Harold's office, not out of urgency, but out of intention, and we reviewed everything carefully, every clause, every condition, every detail that had been put in place long before this moment. And as he spoke, I realized that what my husband had left behind was not just protection, it was understanding, a quiet awareness of how things could change, how people could shift, and how important it was to anchor certain truths in something that could not be easily rewritten. When I left his office, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel relieved. What I felt was steady, grounded, certain in a way that did not require confirmation from anyone else. And when I returned home, I walked through the front door with the same calm presence I had carried all along, because nothing about this place needed to be reclaimed. It had never been lost. A week later, Daniel came by alone, his steps slower this time, his expression more open. And when he sat across from me at the same table where everything had shifted, he did not start with explanations or defenses. He started with a simple sentence: I did not know. And I believed him, not because it excused anything, but because I could see it in the way he held himself, in the way he met my eyes without turning away. And we spoke then, not about blame, not about what should have happened, but about what had happened, the choices, the assumptions, the spaces where trust had been given without question. And I listened, the way I always had, but this time with clarity, with boundaries that did not need to be stated out loud to exist. When he left, there were no promises, no declarations, just a quiet understanding that things were no longer what they had been, and that they would not return to that version again. And as the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, not in sadness, not in anger, but in acceptance, because some changes do not break a life, they redefine it. And as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I carried with me a simple truth, one that no letter, no plan, no assumption could take away. They believed a new heir had replaced me, but they had never understood that I was never part of something that could be replaced.